So like Diogo, I would just like to start by thanking Rodrigo and Amelia. It's been a really fantastic week and so far, and I'm looking forward to the rest of it. And I keep finding myself, as I see all of these people coming to speak and show their work, I keep finding myself kind of nodding along in agreement with all of the things they're saying. And in a way, it's, some of us use fonts with serifs and some of us use fonts without serifs, but in some way, it feels kind of like we're working on a similar project or something, though through different work. Or it's got a great kind of all-together feeling that I've really enjoyed. And I'm also kind of thrilled to be in this room speaking to you. I remember the first time I was here, it was back in 1999 as an architecture student. And I was traveling on a traveling studio to see the work of Suda de Mora and Tavra and Caesar. And it was absolutely transformational to me. It was really the first time I saw what it meant to make good contemporary architecture. I hadn't experienced it before. And it's kind of something that stayed with me since then. And whenever I come back here to Porto, I feel like you're immediately immersed in this great building culture. And it's not just the kind of contemporary work, it's not the new stuff, it's also the old stuff, it's also the city. It's one of these great material cities where the construction of the city permeates its atmosphere. How it's made and how you feel when you're in it are kind of one. And I always like cities like this. I always like cities that have a certain directness about that, or a certain connection to their materiality or to their place. And it's really only when I started making my own work that I started coming back to Porto in my head and the things I'm looking at in the office. And I don't have anything new to say about the Porto School, just that I think it's very important what has been achieved by the people working here, that they've found some way to make architecture now which is constructive of place or reinforcing of place rather than destructive of it, which I think happens too much with contemporary architecture. And in a way, to quote the Danish architect Jensen Klint, to remain modern or to be modern, but to return to sources. And so every time I come here, I feel I have this kind of resonance, and with my own interests. And I'm fortunate enough to work in a country which has its own very rich material or building culture. And my work is very much tied to that building culture in Ireland. And so I thought really the best way to give you insight into my work is to begin by telling you a little bit about Ireland. So I will begin by trying to tell you the entire history of Irish architecture in about 12 slides. So here we go. In Ireland, the prevalent building typologies are fairly limited. The building culture has historically been restricted by a variety of things, by a number of factors. First of all is its relative isolation on the edge of Europe. Its architecture is very much influenced internationally, but mainly vis-a-vis England. It's got limited material resources. There's lots of stone and lots of clay, obviously, but very little timber. It has a limited, let's say, construction skill set because traditionally Ireland was very poor, especially in the 20th century, and so much of the talent was exported to either England or America. And then, of course, there's the climate, very damp, fairly, there's only a 10-degree difference in temperature from the winter average temperature to the summer average temperature. And I was standing out in the courtyard the other day admiring the fog rolling in very beautifully off the ocean and then rolling back out again. In Ireland, it's more like the cloud kind of sits right here over your head, and then sometimes it drops down and kind of swallows you, but it's always somewhat damp. And so, in a way, this kind of set of restrictions, in a way, it didn't make for a kind of paucity of architecture or a lack of richness. It merely limited the forms or the vehicles through which the culture or society was reflected in its architecture. And so I just thought we might cover a few of the kind of dominant types, just very quickly. If we just look at the urban architecture first, the main cities in Ireland, Dublin, Limerick, Cork, they experienced a lot of growth in the 18th and 19th centuries, so their historic cores are very much dominated by the Georgian typology. And the Georgian obviously kind of Palladianism, a kind of loose Palladio influence, again filtered through Lord Burlington and others in England, through Campbell's Vitruvius Britannicus, and then again, as I say, it then through all those filters, all these international influences come to bear on the fabric of Ireland, basically, in the cities. In the major cities, the predominant material is brick, as we see here, and as Jonathan showed his first slide last night of the Georgian England, and said he didn't think that it had been surpassed in terms of city making or of city fabric, and I would say, well, maybe in Ireland actually, because if you look at the Irish Georgian as opposed to the British, the British is very kind of austere in a way, and very regimented and geometrically pure in some ways. And in Ireland, at first glance, it looks like that, but then when you look at the Georgian cityscape, it's always moving. There's always little changes. The windows are getting slightly bigger or slightly smaller, or raising and lowering. The parapets are going up and down. What looks like a kind of symmetrical facade to begin with is actually shifting as you go up the floors. And to me, that adds a kind of level of richness to it, which makes it maybe a little more interesting. And the buildings have this kind of dichotomy between an expressed structure externally, this kind of austere statement of material, and then internally, it's all about lining. It's all about this kind of rich, modulated surface inside. And it's very much this kind of dialogue between the inner and outer in these Georgian buildings. In the kind of small town Ireland, again, this kind of Georgian aesthetic dominates, although in a much kind of rougher way. The buildings are smaller scale, their construction is mainly rubble and plastered, but again, we see the kind of regularity of these rectangular windows, the 1:2 proportion dominates across the country, really. And again, the unifier, there's several unifiers again about, let's say, the restrictions in timber, that there really wasn't a lot of it, and England took what was there originally. And so the scale of the rooms and the scale of the buildings, you don't really get buildings deeper than 13 meters throughout the country. And then the other great unifier is the sash window. And here, this is a photograph from my office. I work in one of these Georgian buildings, and the window is 3.2 meters high, and that sort of tall, grand window is both a function of style, but also a function of climate. It's very dark. We're living in the clouds, and so it's a great way to get light all the way deep into the back of the plan. And so on these cloudy days, my office is filled with light. And although in England and many other places the Georgian was later taken over or usurped by the Victorian and Edwardian, etc., in Ireland it never quite lost a lot of those features. This tall rectangular window dominates even today. Here we have a Victorian terrace, and many of the elements are still quite familiar to something which would have been constructed 200 years previously. And here we have something contemporary and horrible, but actually pretty regular and what we see quite a lot of. So if we move to the countryside very quickly, the countryside is dominated by a compressive architecture, an architecture about compressive construction. And we have a good few of these kind of fantastic Neolithic monuments, like this fort on the Aran Islands, which really is the edge of the earth. It has that feeling about it. And then we have a number of these early Christian settlements, which are kind of dot the landscape. These are all 7th or 8th century churches. But predominantly, the landscape of rural Ireland is dominated kind of by domestic construction primarily. It's highlighted by the occasional tower house. I think the Scots might have us on this one. And the occasional manor house, again, very heavily influenced by a kind of British Palladianism. But as I say, most of it's much more humble than that. The landscape itself is organized into these plots of agriculture. Oftentimes, it's in stone. Really, as a direct result of needing to farm the land needs to be cleared, and so we make walls and we make houses out of that then. So this kind of symbiosis between how we farm and how we make our buildings. Sometimes those are hedgerows. Sometimes they're just stone. And there's a whole kind of language of these things as well. The rounded stones you see there on the right is actually a gate, so that you can take down the stones and then put them back again. But largely the building in the rural landscape is dominated by fairly humble or much smaller scale domestic construction. And I put this kind of cheesy postcard up for a reason. People think, the tourists, whatever, think about Ireland. They think, oh, great, the green landscape and the cottage. And in some way, it's a caricature, but also in other ways, it's still kind of valid. I mean, the cottage exists everywhere in the country. It's still lived in. It's still very much a kind of living thing. And if we look at the technology of that, again, as I said, it's pretty much rubble stone construction, lime plastered. The timber means that we can't get large spans. The lack of carpentry skills means we can't get large spans. So you have throughout the country this plan form of 1 room deep, maybe 4 or 5 meters wide, and rooms in enfilade. Inside quite rough. But then again, we see, up to today, these types of buildings, this aesthetic is what people build in, and I don't think it's necessarily nostalgic. It's just there's never been a break. Modernism in a way was never fully adopted in Ireland the way it was in the rest of Europe. I often was kind of thinking about Rem's Venice Biennale and thinking about this absorbing modernism theme, and I thought maybe the Irish pavilion would just be empty. There's some good examples, but and so. While I disagree in some ways with the aesthetic of this, it's also sort of true in a way. It's, and again, it's just concrete block and simple timber rafter roofs. That simple form, the kind of single room deep, simple volumes, then we often get arranged to make a farmstead or a farm set of buildings. And so these diagrams along the bottom just kind of talk about what are very typical things. You see an infinite variety across the countryside where that same structural system is used to make sheds or is used to make barns, and then they're arranged to make courtyards or a series of yards to create a microclimate, to give you a bit of shelter from the wind and from the rain. So it's a very kind of practical thing, but again, quite rich. And when we see today that, nowadays you can buy much bigger sheds and they're made in metal, that actually they tend to arrange them in exactly the same way they always have, to make this kind of courtyard, to get themselves a protection. And you see them often like this with, a 19th century cottage right next to a 1990s product-built shed. And finally, that brings me to this kind of middle ground between the great manor house and the kind of very humble house. And that we refer to these as the house of the middle size, after an Irish historian named Maurice Craig. And to me, this is probably one of the more interesting typologies, because it's on one hand, you get versions of it which look like this, which, in some way are just a simple cottage, just made 2 stories. But then you kind of look at it again, and actually, it starts to have an influence of this polite architecture. All of a sudden we have 1 to 2 proportioned, windows on this thing, which otherwise is, utterly vernacular. And then we get, grander versions of that, where people had aspirations to maybe live in the grander house, and so you get a very direct kind of symmetrical Palladian influence. And there's always this kind of interesting thing I like in these houses, where there's like, in the Georgian houses, what's important is the symmetry in the room. And so the external facades are kind of always asymmetrical as they move up, because they're making rooms which are symmetrical in terms of where their windows are. Here, though, in the landscape, what's important is this kind of singular object with the kind of symmetrical facade. And so you get these very bizarre rooms like you have in the bottom right there, where, windows jammed into a corner, and then another one, it's, doesn't make any sense, it's into a stair. And this, in a way, this one I can think really kind of sums it up, this kind of amalgam of international, of local, of vernacular, of polite, of so we have a farm shed stuck onto the side of a kind of Georgian building on top of a 2-story cottage. Okay, so, and it's only really recently that we start to get buildings like this. I'm talking the past 20 years, when Ireland started to get a bit more money, until the last 5, when you get this kind of rapacious bungalow, which in a way is horrific and definitely an import of Britain and influenced by construction industry, but in some way also has this kind of resonance with the middle house. So, what this survey does, like any survey of type, is try to reduce this kind of set of variations or richness of a building culture into this simplified, understandable icon. But what I'm more interested in is the contingent, or the eccentricities, or the variety within this kind of loose parameters of all these types, the local variant, structural error, the trying to complete some sort of geometry, like material replacements. These things which make each iteration within type very unique, but part of a larger discourse, that they reflect the person who built it, the community that they're in, the society and the culture that created them. And that to me is kind of where type gets interesting. Yeah, and the other thing, so the other thing is, this gives you some idea of the cultural context that I'm working within, but I think it's important to say that, oftentimes when people are looking at vernacular or traditional architectures, there's this insinuation that you're being nostalgic or something like this, so that this is lost and no longer relevant, so get over it. But in this case, all of these buildings are still lived in, they're still used, they still form the background of the society there, of the culture. The construction methods still haven't changed significantly. They, instead of building in rubble stone, they build in blockwork. We still have to get all of our timber from Finland. So there's a certain persistence of form and use that, this is the landscape of people's lives. And so as an architect, I think you have to decide whether, and I had to decide whether I would, engage with these raw materials, this building culture, or whether I would ignore it to pursue my own agenda, and I've decided very much to engage in it as much as possible. Okay, so I'd like to maybe just start by looking at a few of my urban buildings where we're very much like right up against some of these building types. This one, I didn't build this one. This is the Etruscan gate in Perugia. Maybe it's one of these important images to me. And I like to show it because it kind of embodies a way of making city, which I think is kind of very important and perhaps dominated previous to the 19th century in many places. For whatever reason, is kind of irrelevant, it makes good city. And we have at the bottom, we have an Etruscan gate and wall from the 3rd century BC. Above that, we have a 1st century Roman wall. Above this, on the left, we have medieval houses. And above that, on the top, we have this beautiful 16th century loggia. So you have almost 2,000 years of history when every single iteration in some way is playing deference or having a conversation with the thing which came before and being somehow respectful of it, right? Not trying to usurp it necessarily, but still very much, of course, speaking the language of their time. So this, in a way, this image always kind of is in my head when I'm making buildings in the city. So I'd like to start with a very quiet building. This is for a building for a family center. It's a counseling center in a town called Roscommon, in the very middle of Ireland. It was for a charity, and it was for the client had affiliations with the church, and the person who ran the organization was a nun. And the context is kind of a complicated one. The street that it's on, which we see here, the building which I was extending for the community center is there on the right, but it's part of exactly that, very typical rural Irish city landscape, which I showed you before. And the site is behind this building on the right, and so it's pinned between that, which is actually a conservation area in the town, and then this immense heap of stone at the top there, which is the most important church in town, a kind of neo-Romanesque church from early 20th century. And so I was interested in making a building which, somehow negotiated between these two contexts, and these two contexts which are they're very important to the people who live there and very important to the community. The whole entire parish was very interested in what I might be doing next to their two most important things. So the building, and sorry, we see here, this is the site. I forgot to put a red dot on it, but that's the existing house, and this is where we built, and this is that street, and this is the huge church. So the plan, in a way, is very simple. It's just, you see the original in gray. It's just a simple collection of rooms, of counseling rooms on the ground floor. The people who come here are oftentimes in duress of some kind. They're being counseled for bereavement or alcoholism or things like this. And so they were interested in having soft rooms, that the place was primarily welcoming. And so each of these gives a slightly different atmosphere depending on what they're doing. And then you rise up, and to the rear we get this large meeting hall, which in a way was one of the main purposes of building the building. And as I say, I wanted to make something which was kind of quiet. And so the exterior, is very simple. It blends in a way, or converses. Again, I use this word a lot. I liked it to have a dialogue with that streetscape. So the pitches are similar, the tall rectangular windows, the material palette, all of this. But again, I was interested in this play of asymmetry of these windows, that they're always kind of moving. And so you see on the side elevation, that they're shifting about that string course, sometimes aligning, sometimes making sense, sometimes not. And that also then, the structure, which I'm always playing with and I'll speak of later, also is able to kind of modulate the relationship between inside and outside, that you have an ope, which is about addressing the way up to the church, but then because the room on the right is bigger and the room on the left is smaller, that the lintels move to change the character of the room. Inside, in a way, as is the tradition, the rooms are very simply lined. The budget here was, virtually nothing, and so we were trying to do a lot with paint and plaster. And each room changes color based on where it is in the building and what kind of light it might get, in very soft iterations of a theme. I didn't really dress these rooms up, I left the plants in, how they use it. The furniture, it is how it is. We then move upstairs. This is from the stair hall looking towards the large meeting room, and in the meeting room we have this kind of moment where there's this dome, and the dome in a way, if the exterior of the building has a conversation with the street, then the interior in this dome room in a way has a conversation to me with the religious context of it. And so one can take this section. And I have to be honest, this is a dome with an oculus on it. I struggled with the idea of making a dome with an oculus in 2013. Perhaps this is ridiculous. It's crazy of me. I had this gut instinct that I needed to do something to it. I moved it around. I'm shifting it, making it asymmetrical. And then I realized that this is the context we're in. This is the way that architects today think, and I think too much, that we have to add some kind of witticism to something, or we have to be clever in some way. And in the end, this dome, it just needs to be done well. It just has to be a good space. And I think I got sort of close, I think. So I left it. And the other thing, I think, there was a conversation the other night about responsibility and architecture and what responsibility we might have. And one time I went back to this building, and one of the people who was getting counseling there came up to me, and she was getting counseling for her small daughter having passed away. And she said to me that in that counseling room was the first time she'd had peace, felt peace since her daughter had died. And to me that makes that whole thing worth it. That to me is a responsibility that I think is important to me. So I would just like to move along then to this building in Dublin, on Henrietta Street. Henrietta Street in Dublin is one of the most important Georgian streets. It's the most complete in many ways. It's the earliest. The site you see in red, I remember to put it on this one, is that slot in red at the bottom. This is the map from the 1756, and this is a photograph of the street. The site is at the end here. It's a very interesting street. It has many of these things about the Georgian typology, which I've spoken of before. Originally, it was built for the most important people in the country, archbishops, people in parliament, developers. But then very quickly, the money in Dublin moved to the other side of town, and so very quickly, these things became tenement houses. You would have 90 people living in this building, families of 15 living in one room. And so now we find these buildings as almost kind of like a ruin, with all these layers of this history very much exposed because they haven't been, turned back to this perfect 18th century building. Some people are living in them this way, others are artist studios, but the scale is tremendous. So here we have the site. This was actually a 4-bay building like you see here, but the last 2 bays went derelict and were knocked down by the city council. And so they were interested in having a competition to replace it, to, in a way, somehow complete this important block and to use it as a way to generate interest in the street. The two bays that are left right here belong to an organization called Napibiri Ilyn, which is the Ilyn Pipe Association of Ireland, which Ilyn Pipes, I had a clip here, but which I can't play for you, is, unfortunately there's no internet in this room, as you found. The Ilyn Pipes are an indigenous version or a cousin of the Scottish bagpipes, except you don't blow into them. They're a much softer tone, and they have this great kind of thing where there's this drone underneath it, there's always this hum, but then they have that kind of lilt you have in Irish music happening over it. And so it's always this, it feels kind of primitive somehow. So anyways, the building is an extension and an expansion of their organization. And so here you see from the end, here we have this fantastic Georgian street with all its kind of subtle movements. At the end, we have this great 19th century law society building, which does this amazing shift. And then here we have the gap, which had to be filled. And so, of course, I was interested, again, in this dialogue, with how we might have a dialogue with all this richness which is there, with that culture which is there. And so I was interested in completing that Georgian street somehow, of playing with that rhythm, of using what was there and bringing it back somehow. And all around town, you see moments like this, where when the Georgians ran into problems, where something didn't add up, where they couldn't make a window, where the geometry didn't work out, they would do this, which is to make blind windows. So if you have a stair or something, it's a way of completing something logically. And so this was kind of in the back of my mind. The project is to make workshops so that they can build Ilyn pipes. And so I had in mind, since the architecture there is so brick, the structure is brick and is kind of true in a way. I wasn't thinking of these 19th century, brick warehouses with a very robust or kickable aesthetic. And then I started looking at the block itself, and this is the elevation, and as I say, we're on the left there, but when you look at the right, there's what seems like a very typical, not particularly skillful neoclassical building, which seems at first glance symmetrical, but when you look at it again, you realize there's an extra bay on the end of it, on the far right. And you look again, and you see that actually that bay is ever so slightly set back, and it turns out that last bay also was an extension to the end of this entire street. And when you turn the corner, that bay actually was built in the late 1800s by a man who had a kind of interest in Louis Sullivan, as I do. And so he had this kind of thing, right, where he made a very subtle step just to delineate difference, but then when you turn the corner, he was able to do something which is very much in his time. And so I thought, to me, this was kind of brilliant. And so in a way, what I tried to do was make a bookend to the entire block, right? Something which can speak about the Georgian, but also can speak about the very specific things of the block, and then can be about this idea that this is actually a series of rough workshop rooms working all the way up through the section, and what we get as our elevation in a way is just a kind of expressed section, and all in brick. So we have the blind windows to the front, playing very much a Georgian game, acknowledging that what was there is not there anymore. And then to the side, we have kind of new but referential. These are all very early renderings, but it's in progress now. And I think to me, this corner to me is in a way achieves something which I find really interesting. And I was thinking of when I was looking at Diogo's project for the theater there, where you have this kind of this moment where in a kind of single moment you can perceive simultaneously the past and the present. That they're all there, they're all resonant off of each other. They are not distinct, they're kind of one, and I think there's a real power in that. Okay, this one is a very small project, and I show it really only because it was actually very important to me in terms of progressing my own work. It's an extension to a house, a terraced house in a Dublin suburb. Again, you now are all very familiar with this type of architecture. Quite typical in many ways, again, the brick express structure, the lined rooms, the tall sashes, and in this case, it's a double-fronted building, so it's basically very simple but fine rooms arranged around a stair. And so, in Ireland and as elsewhere, there's often this kind of gut reaction or knee-jerk reaction when you're extending an existing building that you make something different, very different. And it's a reaction in a way to the Venice Charter and, you know, conservation theory and stuff. But I mean, to me, I think architects are kind of too gentle with their physical connection to these buildings. You know, we see a lot of glass step-offs, and then they're too abrasive in terms of their formal conversation with those buildings, you know, so then we make something formally outrageous, but because we didn't touch it. And I'm sort of interested in the other thing, that we might make something which has formal dialogue or material dialogue, but actually can, you know, and that's what we tried to do in this. So I tried to extend it in the logic of the house, another simple, complete room in a way around a stair. It had to be kept very low to get under the windowsills. But then perhaps it has a dialogue with this actually fairly formal rear elevation, which we see here. And so the dialogue is material, you know. I'm using a very similar brick. It's a similar bond. It plays off the symmetry of the house and that grand window to the staircase in the center. But then, you know, the client wanted to be able to close off the house to the garden. So in some ways it opens in a very modern way, but then she wanted to close it off. And so we pushed the central columns. So in some way it's a symmetrical thing, but it's not symmetrical moving back into it. So we pushed the central columns back into the room such that we could do this. And then the elevation sort of changes. And again, as I say, you know, I'm interested in Louis Sullivan and his idea about, or the way he described it anyways, about this kind of balance between what he called the masculine, or the heavy, the structural, the really robust parts of architecture, and then this kind of delicateness, the lightness, the ornament to him. And I also, you know, I love this painting, and I was always kind of thinking of this as well, about this kind of, this era of late Gothic, early Renaissance painting where you always have a kind of pattern and then you have a figure set off of that pattern. And there's this kind of dialogue between the power of the singular and the power of the many, or of number, which Ruskin and Perret and all these people talk about. And so to me, the screen was an opportunity to kind of explore that idea. So we made the screen with this pattern on it, a Penrose pattern, something purely mathematical in a way. And we get this kind of the robustness and then the fineness. And this idea carries inside then, where we get this kind of singular thing, right? The cornice is structural. It's a structural cornice, and it's singular in a way, and then it's counterposed against the many. And the reason, you know, I show this extension is because of how it has to do with structure and how it changed my thinking of structure. When we started out, I was just interested in making something. Well, I was interested in how structure could speak about something true, or perhaps timeless or something. And as I went on through this project, I realized that actually structure could do so much more. You know, it can be tuned. It can be tuned to give rooms character. And so here, you know, I made the joists very weak. And because they're very weak, they come much closer together. And so they get, again, much more numerous, and the pattern changes and the shadow. And so that taught me a lot, you know. So we have this idea about honesty, and we have this idea about the singular and the many, and about tuning it. And then I showed you the picture of the room, and this room is very much like the existing rooms, lined with a cornice. Hardly neoclassical, though. Okay, I might just speed through this. I mean, so that sort of set us off, that project in a way, set me off on, and I just wanted to say a couple of things about structure in my work, you know. My interest in it comes through like a variety of sources. I'm not really interested in making architecture that's about form. Anytime I find myself designing something or making something that's formally based, I have a reaction against it. I don't like plaster. I'm wary of cladding. And I'm interested in spaces which have a sense of permanence, of a sense of realness, a sense of inevitability, and to me, structure gets at all of these things right away. And so, and then also there's that thing about the way that structure, how something is made, can have a conversation with a building culture. So I won't talk about these. These are just a series of structural experiments. Here's one looking at timbral vaulting, which is a way that we will be building the thing on Henrietta Street. So we tried it out. We built a dome. We wanted to see what we could do. I did this with Clancy Moore. Another thing I'm kind of interested in is how structure can lead to a form, or how something is made will lead directly to form, or how it will arise directly, to take this kind of designing of form out of it. And so this is a way of making a vault without using centering. It's called a leaning vault. So all you need is a wall to lean against, and then you make courses which go like this, so you can make it over the top without building anything underneath. And so, all you need is the wall to lean against. So you lean against one side, you lean to the outsides, everything leads towards the center. And so I made this thing for a house where a series of these leaning vaults all lean against a singular wall, and then that wall is cut wherever they intersect, which gets us a plan kind of like this. This one, again, just taking a primitive structure which I find in the landscape, the ridge-supported roof, and that would be supported with posts oftentimes in very primitive architecture. And here just playing with a very simple idea about how what happens if one post is caught. This is being constructed right now. Here, playing with the idea of the urban plot and how the plot is always about these side. The Irish like to wall off everything. And so all of the gardens are walled, and here we have a garden which is walled, and just simply an idea of spanning to make space within a garden. And the theme of those exposed rafters comes back again here, stained slightly white, as opposed to being stained slightly dark. Okay, so that brings me to this house in the country. The last two projects I'll talk about are in the far west of Ireland, in Galway. The landscape in Galway, in this part of Galway, in the far west of Galway, looks like this. This is Connemara, and it's extremely barren. It really does, you think about people when they believed that the earth was flat, and that the edge of the world got more and more confrontational, and the weather more crazy as you got to the edge, and this is how you feel when you're there today. The weather changes every 5 minutes. 1 minute it's sunny, the next minute it's thunderstorming. There's rainbows every other minute. It's pretty extraordinary. The trees, when they exist, they look like this. Gives you some idea of what you have to deal with. Okay, so this house is a house for a rural setting. It was built in a farm field, and right adjacent to that house, we find this building, which, as I say, and you all now know, is very much fits the Irish farmhouse typology, where very simple volumes are arranged to make a courtyard and you can see what they need to be protected from now. You don't want to end up like that tree, and so and the thing about this is, to me, is this, this is a product of the local building culture. It's a response to the climate, it's a response to the materials which are at hand, and the people there, it has a resonance to them, it makes sense to them, they still use it. And again, the construction methods are still not particularly different. There's material and there's formal persistence in this landscape. And so here you see, this is the site plan. Up here we have that thing I just showed you, and here we have our site with our house. Here we have a house of the middle size. Here we have several problematic bungalows. But really it is that kind of wild landscape in a way. So just several things. So I began with the farmhouse, partly, as an initial gut reaction, right? And there's a thing here again about how form arises from structure, and I'll talk about that in a second. But I also wanted to speak about the form of the building and the form that arises from the organization, about these simple pitched roofs as well. And as Diogo was saying, I think architects have this tendency now to try to make some sort of emotive connection with the people who see or visit their buildings. They try to get this connection through difference or through shock or something, and through unfamiliarity. And I think this is, there's a place for this, and in some ways this is important. But I also think there's a way to connect to people, to get added a kind of immediate and intuitive emotional connection with people who visit your buildings by dealing very closely with the familiar and kind of changing that somehow, or using that latent energy maybe. And especially for me, my clients they're not art dealers, they're not, they're nuns and school teachers and bank managers, and these are, and they're not versed in the language of architecture in this discourse, and I'm kind of interested in how I can make something which is, talks to both worlds and can be powerful for anybody. And so I think this kind of local form in a way is a way at getting at that, dealing with these kind of traditional forms. So, but to me, I have to get there through structure. And so when you look at this as the side of that same farmyard, what we see is the rubble stone construction here. But oftentimes, because this was not built so well, they would pour this kind of concrete ring beam all the way around the top of it. And what that concrete ring beam is kind of holds it all together, especially when the roof won't be built so well either. And so it's a necessary thing. This is immediately next to that is this farm shed. And you have this very rough concrete, which is used quite a lot out there. It's often poured in lifts. And again, this question about precision, which has come up a lot this week, there's no precision here. But I think there's a certain value in that. So here we have the plan. It's quite straightforward in many ways. It's 3 simple volumes around a courtyard to get us protection. That volume faces south, which is that way. Originally, it was kind of a service volume, public rooms, and then private rooms. The recession took a bite out of this one, about that size. And so you enter into a small courtyard, looking out over the primary courtyard. You enter laterally, and then there's kind of these 2 connected rooms, and then back to the private realm. There's the rain. And so I wanted, in the main spaces, I wanted to make this thing of these two, of this very open thing, very direct structurally, in some way recalling the cottage, and utilizing the ring beam. And so here we have that ring beam, but in this case, it gets a lot more stuff in it. It does the structural job. It resists the outwards thrust of this roof, which is otherwise unrestrained. It also deals with rain. It's got a giant gutter. And then it kind of defines the character of the room as well, and of the building, so it works inside and outside. Here you see it across the landscape. Here you see it in the field or from the road. Here, direct reference to that farmstead with the kind of double gables. And as I say, I kind of like the eccentricity in the type, right? The kind of odd moment. And this to me is an odd moment, but I kind of really enjoy. Entering into the courtyard, a well-positioned cat. And then inside here, you see that datum again. You see the room defined by this singular and the many again, and the open structure. This thing, again, the good thing about making something which it was designed to be quite robust, not so precise, that things could go wrong and it would be okay. The first site visit, I went out there, and there's this colonnade to the courtyard, and to the right there, and it structurally had to be poured in concrete, and it was poured 250 mil in the wrong direction. And the builder was the client's brother, and so we had to leave it, and so we left it. So there's about a precision there that's about that. This is the leeway we're dealing with. And inside, it's the same. It's not so finely detailed, but it's okay. Okay, and I'll end with this project. This is a house in Clifton, which is the further left on that map I showed you, the farthest out to your back in this picture. The next thing is Boston. And it's what you arrive at. This, in a way, is like the last enclave, the last piece of civilization of anything before, on either side of you in a way. You come through this barren landscape, and then you get another barren landscape of the Atlantic Ocean immediately after you. So you feel like you're in this island when you're out there. The site for the project was here. There's this river which runs through town, and the site's here, right on a floodplain. And so the strange thing about the site, after we're investigating, can we even build in this thing? And my immediate reaction, I'm in this town, of course, you know how I think now, and I wanted to make some sort of town building which might, eventually be part of the city fabric. But because the building was in this floodplain, there was this very small corner that we could build on, and apart from that small corner, nothing of it would ever be allowed to be built on. And so you ended up with this thing which was like an island within an island. Eventually it might be surrounded by city fabric, but it itself could never be part of it. It was always going to stand alone. And in my neighborhood in Dublin, there's this building called the Casino at Marina, which we have here, which to me is the best piece of architecture in Ireland. And it was originally built, this is a front door sort of to it, so keep that in mind for a second. It's like this kind of little jewel in a way. It was built by William Chambers for Lord Charlemont, and it was in a way a folly to his main manor house on the coast of outside of Dublin, and it was like this pleasure pavilion. But it's this geometrically pure but seemingly very rational thing that's full of all these contradictions and tricks and spatial games and things. It's incredibly rich. And so here you see this idealized version of it in the landscape, but now it's like this, right? It's been swallowed. And it's right here. And so here you have suburbia, you have this school, which is not very good, you have this other thing, this is all horrible subdevelopment, and here you have this kind of pristine, geometric island in an island. And so I was kind of reminded of this thing. I might just tell you a couple of things about it. The plan is an amazing thing. It's symmetrical in both ways when you look at it in one instance, and then the next thing you see, there's all these different rooms with different characters within it. They're all knit together extremely intelligently. There's the way you deal with rain comes down each of these columns here from these pockets on the roof, and it's when you look at the section that you really start to see the level of interest here, that the rooms are changing their scale based on the size they are in plan, that something which might have to read to a landscape as a door which addresses landscape and must be grand, so it's this height. Actually, to the room, it's only this high, and so there's like a little door within a big door. This sort of game plays out, and again, here you have a grand room which can have a grand window, so that's fine, but then in the other section, the rooms are smaller, right? And so externally, we have a grand window, and internally, we get on both sides that internally the lining comes down to cover half of the window, and it's painted black. And he did this amazing thing where he cut each of the panes of glass and angled them ever so slightly upwards so that they reflect the sky, so that you cannot see the fact that he's covering the window. So, anyways, it's clearly genius, this thing. So I had this in mind, right? This kind of geometrically pure thing, this island in an island, and of course the middle house is always there. And so this is my answer to that site. In a way, I kind of imagined it in its original state. It's actually surrounded by lots of stuff, but I kind of imagined it in this primitive state, and I also imagined it in its ruined state. So it kind of sits somewhere strange in terms of its time. The plan, this is a plan that I'm not quite sure I'm comfortable with. This is my second confession of the lecture. The clients asked for curves. That's all they said. They wanted curves, which I maybe have a hard time with, But I thought, if I'm an architect, I must give them the one thing that they asked for. And so I tried to give them curves in section. That was one version, to make vaulted rooms. They weren't accepting that. And then I tried to give them rooms which were curved but carved out of a solid somehow. And then they were like, no, Ryan, we want curves inside and we want curves outside and in plan, so stop messing around. And so in a way, the plan here begins with the Casino at Marino, filtered in some way through, again, Palladio, going to the origins of much polite country architecture in Ireland, so there's a hint of emo in here as well. And so we just scoop out the corners with these curves. You come in from the road here. This wall here is, which you saw in the previous, is a wall to protect the house from flooding. And so the house itself is raised up on this kind of raised territory. So you get a kind of formal garden here, and then you get the wild again. And in a way that calls back to the house in the farmhouse, where there was a kind of manicured, austere center surrounded by a wild farm. So the way you come in through the center here, through a series of small spaces, and then into what is this, in a way, on all sides is linked open space. And the threshold between each of these rooms, they each have their own definition, although technically they're open plans. So they're defined by the structure in the ceiling, and then defined by this threshold, which is the pinch between the curve and the rectilinear. Upstairs, it's simply, again, playing off the middle house size, where the house of the middle size, where rooms are always a matrix of rooms, where there's never hallways. And so upstairs, that's what I was interested in doing. So you get bathrooms connecting to rooms and closets connecting to rooms. And the only kind of break in that is at each corner, you get this kind of scoop taken out, except for that one. And this has to do with basically the windows here. On the ground floor, there are only windows on these sides. And on the upper floor, the windows are in the curves. And those windows then only allow light to come in and come down into the ground floor. So it's a sectional game, again, referencing the casino. Again, I was kind of interested in the idea of this thing being what it might exist like as a ruin. And so I was thinking of those amazing drawings by Auguste Choisy of the Roman ruins, where they do these kind of amazing worm's eye views, and there's the kind of hint of all the growth surrounding the thing, and certainly this thing is surrounded by overgrowth. And so this is looking into it, and you can see I was interested in how I might make the curve structural somehow. And so really the structure, you set up these structural walls of the curves, and then they're connected. Each of the points of the curves are connected by beams, and then those beams define the rooms, and then where's the gap between those beams, you get light falling from above down each of the curved walls. At the center, just this core. Here you maybe can see that better. So here you see some guesstimation of what it would be with the wall to the floodplain. I'm standing in the floodplain right here, surrounded by that kind of wild vegetation, and then this geometrically pure thing set up onto a raised plinth. And to me, really, this is the thing that makes that plan okay. That somehow the space feels right, it feels good. And to me, in a way, after all of this kind of thinking about things, this is the judge about how successful or not successful architecture is to me, is the quality of the room. And to me, this is a good room. And my feeling about the house, I was reading this book by Michael Benedict called For an Architecture of Reality. And my kind of feeling about this house and about in a way, the direction I'm going, that this thing, the feeling about this house to me, he has this quote. It says, "Like nature's objects, it feels both arbitrary and inevitable." I'll end with that.